Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. My name is Joe Thomas. Thank you for letting us be part of your weekend. You can find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. You can also download podcasts of this program, previous episodes, in our archives at youtube.com and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our first guest is from a great organization, the Reason Foundation. Marc Joffe is back. He's their senior policy analyst, and he just wrote a great piece on the telecommuting that has become a necessity for so many companies because of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 breakout across the world. Marc, first and foremost, I presume this means you're doing well and everyone in your world is doing well. Welcome to the program.
Yes. Hi, Joe. My wife and I are hunkered down here in Northern California where we had the first shelter-in-place order. It's becoming pretty boring, but fortunately everyone is doing well.
Now, we've been trying to find those things that are going to be changes in the American lifestyle after this. And I think this has forced a lot of people to go through the list of things that they do and really prioritize the needs from the likes and the wants. And your column takes the point that, sure, telecommuting might have been awkward at first, but it might be good for all of American business coming out of this, aside from being a good way to help isolate and flatten the curve of the coronavirus. Explain what you mean.
Well, telecommuting has an important benefit in terms of reducing resource use. So here in the Bay Area where I live, the commuter trains have become very crowded, or had become very crowded before this happened, and land prices were going up rapidly, so it became very expensive to live here and get to work. And of course, the roads are very congested. So if we rely more on remote work, it's really possible for people to become much more spread out and to reduce the need to commute to a central business district to work. So we could really enjoy a lot of benefits to the climate and to government finance because of the no longer having the need to invest so much in infrastructure from telecommuting. So I think it's one of those good things that's coming out of what's really a very, very bad situation overall.
Well, here in our flagship city of Charlottesville, some people still refer to one of our more famous natives, Thomas Jefferson. Some don't, but we do what we can. And he once said, if we pile each other together as they do in European cities, we'll be ripe for the same corruption they see in European cities, warning us against the kind of cluster cities that we've evolved into for a lot of this. So you're seeing this as a possible way to break out of this. Does it also impact the workforce, saying, you know what, it is no longer a location centric? You can look for the best people for a job no matter where they are. So the fruits of your efforts will be more easily accepted by people just because you're better at what you do, not just because you happen to live nearby.
Yes, I certainly see that. And I think it's really good, potentially really good news for rural areas like southwestern Virginia, where people could be located there, working for organizations based in Washington, D.C. or New York or whatever, and enjoy a better quality of life and lower cost of living. So I think it could be a real game changer in terms of opportunities for people who are somewhat, quote-unquote, off the grid right now.
It also strikes me that it would drive the municipalities a little nuts because they rely so heavily on property value tax collections. And I know that Reason Magazine has always been one of the Reason Foundation has always been one of my go-to when it comes down to, funding schools and government with property tax collections creates bad schools and gentrified neighborhoods, and nothing good really comes out of it. So maybe we can even break that cycle with it. And cities are no longer going to be able to dominate with massive tax rates just because they're so necessary for people to live in them.
Yes, There has been over the decades a move towards state funding of education as opposed to reliance on property taxes, and that'll depend on the state. Coming from the left, I think a lot of people are concerned with what they perceive as inequities in public school education caused by the fact that some people are fortunate enough to live in affluent areas that can generate a lot of property taxes, and others not so much. So this is one area where there might be agreement across the political spectrum on sort of leveling out educational spending nationally.
Now, one of the questions is, and we hear this frequently, where people want to have a government utility similar to the way they had taken over the phone system, where it became this public-private partnership of the government would become the operator of, and then private companies would operate on the infrastructure of a phone system. I've heard that referred to as the way we have to go forward with our internet service. If we are to be a much more telecommuting community, isn't the need to get broadband, high-speed internet access, you mentioned Southside Virginia as a great example, that the case for it?
Well, that's a very interesting point, and I think it varies depending on where you are. So where I live in an edge city about 25 miles outside of San Francisco in an apartment building, I'm fortunate enough to have access to gigabit internet for $80 a month. And I think that's a product of the fact that it was cost-effective for that vendor to wire up a building of 180 units that's located in a dense area. Those economics are really different when you get into a rural area with sparse population. And I have been following the advocacy of a lot of folks who believe that there should just be a state or national investment in broadband. And honestly, I have to say that that's a lot less bad than a lot of the other infrastructure projects I've seen advocated. For example, in the Green New Deal, the idea that we would build like a high-speed rail from New York to Chicago, given the fact that it's been such a disaster here in California.
Oh my gosh,
why would we want to do something like that? So, if we have to have a public intervention, I think rural broadband is one of the least bad. But I think we could also really look at what incentives private operators could have, or private companies could have in building out this infrastructure, and try to reduce their costs of entry and costs of doing business, so that we could get more of this work privately funded.
Well, and I know they point to the old phone company, but I don't think we were nearly as creative then as we are now. And I think the federal government just doesn't have the resources, nor, quite honestly, the technical savvy to do a broadband network on their own. And I think, as you mentioned, empowering some of the folks who are already in the business to make sure that those get out there. What about... And we're going to run to a break here, and we'll come back. I want to talk some more about this idea of telecommuting with Marc Joffe. Marc Joffe is the Senior Policy Analyst for the Reason Foundation, not only fighting COVID-19, flattening the curve with telecommuting, but also perhaps helping businesses in the long term. What about the idea that if a business was to use you as an engineer or an architect or a graphic designer or whatever it is you're doing, designing code, and you can live wherever you want, what about the possibility of the company putting your internet service to your house because that's how you're going to commute to work?
Well, that's a great idea, and the company would still save money from that, given the high cost of office space in dense areas like New York and San Francisco. The cost per square foot multiplied by, say, the 100 square feet that has to be allocated to a particular employee is pretty substantial. And I would think that would be more than the cost of paying for an employee's broadband service if they work remotely.
So I guess the scenario I see is then what do we do with all these downtowns that nobody wants to be in anymore? Because I used to live in Buffalo, New York, and I know what an abandoned downtown area looks like, and it's bleak. Cities would be then forced municipally to try to figure out a way to reinvent themselves, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate this counter trend. I mean, we've really been through this long arc of concentration, and Buffalo is an example of a city that lost out. But the big mega cities, the New York metropolitan area, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, to a lesser extent Chicago. They've just really messed up on their public finance, so they're not as attractive. But these cities have enjoyed a really long boom, and while this seems to be like a real seminal event that might change things, I think, I just don't know if we're going to get to a situation where just everyone is out in a rural area and cities, tumbleweeds are blowing through the city. I don't think it's going to quite go that far. So we may not have to worry about that, but it's certainly true that cities that have been failing over the last 30 or 40 years may get worse as a result of this.
So that Las Vegas from Blade Runner 2049 is never going to come to pass, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I saw that.
I thought that was. It took me a while to identify what city he was in. I went, oh, it's Vegas. That's where he is. Hey, Marc, what about the companies? Because I talked to a human resources guy last week about kind of this topic of how does a manager and how does an employee, and because it is a different relationship when you're not in the same room, or you can't just storm down the hall or stand in somebody's cubicle with your cup of coffee and your suspenders and say, okay. So more cultural references dropping out of the sky here. But it's a different management style that's required for bosses of a decentralized company, as it is also. It's very hard. I did it for a week after I got back from CPAC because they had heard about the outbreak there, and they made me work from home. And it's hard. It's a discipline to be a home worker and still be productive. It's a real different paradigm. Yes.
There are a couple of things I would say there. First of all, a lot of people have trouble working from home because they have distractions from family members or pets or whatever, or they just find it difficult to compartmentalize between what they normally do at home, like watch TV, versus working. So one solution for that I actually, because I've been working from home really for the last 9 years, one solution for that that I've tried and found some benefit from is going to a co-working space. Now, that's not a great solution at the moment because we're socially distancing, but eventually that could come back, and you could see people saying, well, I want the camaraderie of a workspace. I want to be there with other people who are working, and I want to be distracted by non-work kind of activities. So I'll go to a co-work space and develop relationships there. The other point I want to make is about the issue of slacking, because I've seen this quite a bit. So one concern is, well, if people are working from home, how do we really know that they're going to be working? They might just be not working. And I think that there's two answers to that. One is a lot of people these days are intrinsically motivated. They find whatever it is that they're doing very exciting, and they want to work on it. So that's less of a worry. But what about people who are not intrinsically motivated? One area that we can look at there, which is a little bit scary, but if it's done right, maybe is the right solution, is the fact that when you're working online, all of your keystrokes theoretically go over the internet. So there are ways for a manager to monitor how much work you're actually doing. But from a civil liberties point of view and a privacy point of view, I certainly see a lot of problems with that. So there has to be some happy medium there where it's possible to monitor productivity without getting too intrusive.
Well, and certainly management would have to be become very project and deadline oriented, saying, hey, I need this by this date and this time, and then that becomes your productivity is okay, and then realistic goals in that end. It is how the paradigm would have to shift. How far into this were we already, Marc? And I know that a couple of millennials I know and I were talking about the pollution statistics, the air quality over some of the major American cities since this work from home, since this coronavirus shelter in place went into place, and they came after me with the, well, Mr. Climate Denier. I said, I was never a climate denier. I don't like pollution. Why don't we just call it pollution? And then we can all agree that polluting is a bad thing. thing to do. Don't make it like it's some political agenda or some economic process that that is going to somehow make the polar bears wealthy or something along those lines. But just say, hey, dirty air is bad. I'm fine with that. We're good. Don't tell me to unemploy 3.3 million people to do it. But that being said, is this feeding in to something that was already starting, where we were seeing more telecommuting and more distance work and more gig employment, even at the executive level?
Well, there certainly has been a long but slow trend towards more and more remote working. So the census figures that I quoted in the op-ed suggest that it's just over 5%. I think that was from 2018. Mm-hmm. With the potential for it to rise to upwards of 50 or 60%, given the way work is these days. That there's just more and more things that you can do remotely. But there's always going to be in-person work, especially at restaurants, for example. And I think before people take too much solace in the lack of pollution that we have right now, we have to realize that what we currently have is totally unsustainable. Mm-hmm. We're basically shutting down the economy and then printing money in order to keep everyone paid. And that might work for a few weeks or a couple of months, but it's not a permanent solution because the government prints up money that doesn't create wealth. And we're destroying a lot of wealth right now by sheltering in place. So while that might be necessary, it's got to end at some point, and we've got to have a situation where people are free to move around and go to theaters and restaurants and so forth, and keep that very important personal contact part of the economy operating.
Mark, is this also? I mean, if we do this, I see a lot of people who they're jobbers. They're even in white collar professions. They're almost like a lawyer, where you contract with me for this project, but I don't work for you outside of that. Given some of the costs of human resources and the fact that a lot of companies had been downsizing all the way through their human resources department and hiring outside or laying off their human resources department and then hiring them back as a contractor. This is still a trend that I see companies doing. Is it good for the companies, or is it dangerous for the workforce to be in this sort of very mercantile, hey, what's it worth to you? I can work for you for a couple hours here, and maybe I'll work for somebody else for a couple hours there. At the end of the day, even at a white collar level.
Well, you are in a position where you're then doing a lot of selling. If you can't get long-term contracts that pay reasonably, then you're constantly looking for the next gig. Whereas when you're a full-time employee, you have a fair level of security that you're going to come in from week to week and get a stable salary. So it doesn't work so well at the executive level or at the upper white collar level if it's very, very short-term gigs. If you can use platforms like Upwork to get longer assignments, then it starts to make sense. Now, I have to be honest, with you and your listeners. There's one aspect of this kind of web-based gig work that many Americans would be uncomfortable with, which is that a lot of these gigs are going to people in low-cost developing countries. Mm-hmm. So that's great for the employer, and it's ultimately great for the consumer because we can accomplish things a lot less expensively by using the most cost-efficient labor that's available in the world. But it can be difficult for some white-collar employees who are used to receiving, first-world wages, now having to compete with people in the third world who may have similar or better skills.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head of the biggest issue I think we're going to face as we come out of this and supply chain. And I know it's kind of off topic, but the issue of what is it worth to us? If manufacturing something in the United States is something we support, but what I think it was Ron Paul in 2012 said, I don't know if a $5,000 iPad helps the American economy either. either, which may have been an extreme depiction of it, but everyone was bashing Apple for having its factories in China at the time. So we have to strike a balance. What is your labor worth, and what is the consumer willing to pay for the product that you're helping to make? I think, is something that we really should be resetting to, and not just having this, it's just going to go up 5% every year because, well, it's a new year. And I think, both in government expenditures, but also in corporations and prices and salaries, all those things, become almost axiomatic. And I think we've gotten to a point where that may be what's resetting. Yeah,
well, I think over the long term and for the benefit of the general population, not only the United States but the rest of the world, it's good for companies to be able to create goods and services in the most cost-efficient way possible. But that cost efficiency does often create very visible problems for people who are not the most cost-efficient providers. So, for example, people who are working in a factory in the upper Midwest may not be able to compete from a cost per unit standpoint from people in a factory in Mexico and China. And, that's one reason why President Trump was elected, because people are upset about that. And I appreciate that it's hard for people to think about what's good for the long term and what's good for the general community, and that people tend to be focused very much on their individual situation. But I think that narrative has to be there, that we are better off from having a global division of labor. That's why we live in such a rich country right now.
Absolutely, and I think we can keep it that way, as I believe in the American workforce. And one of the things that made us exceptional was that when we chose where we worked harder, even more so than people who may have worked for less, Marc. But I appreciate it. Great piece. We'll link up to it on our podcast of this as well. It's at reason.org where you can read it. Marc Joffe, Senior Policy Analyst. Thank you so much. I'm glad everyone is well out there in San Francisco.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Take care.
Up next, Sidney Powell, former federal prosecutor, lawyer to some of the big names right now in D.C., and the co-author of a book called Conviction Machine on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.